For those of you who are visitors here, welcome to this, and I hope that you find this a nurturing service as we talk a bit about this church and where it's going and what's happening. We have a special guest today that I'll introduce you, and many of you met yesterday, but it's going to be a really fun service. So I want to introduce you to my grandparents. So I don't know if you can see me in them or not, but I want to tell you a little bit of a story about my grandfather. I grew up with my grandfather, and he was someone that I didn't really know well. He was kind of aloof, and my picture of my grandpa was of someone who sat in a lazy boy chair watching Lawrence Welk. That's pretty much what he did. And so he wasn't one of those people who was like warm and fuzzy. He always kind of had a little bit of that kind of half smile on his face, nice guy, but didn't really know anything about him. And then, long after he passed away, my grandmother passed away first from advanced breast cancer, and then he died of a heart attack a few years later. Long after that, I was moving from Boston to Seattle, and I knew that I had family because I knew that he had grown up in the Midwest, and they met in South Dakota, and I knew that he had started a construction company near Kirkland, Washington, and built a number of the houses there and everything. But they had lived very, very modestly in a home and everything. So when I was driving across country, I thought, well, I'm going to stop off and see this family, like their brothers and sisters that still lived there. And they were absolutely delighted to meet me and my sister who was with me. And we had one of those Midwest meals that you have casserole and the Jello mold and it was awesome. And they wanted to tell us all these stories about my grandpa and grandma, and in particular about my grandpa, because they were sort of surprised that he turned out so well. It turns out that my grandfather came from the wrong side of the tracks. In fact, because a lot of what he grew up in was the Depression, they lived in tents on the side of the road. He and the whole family were sort of vagrants, in a sense, in the town. And in fact, he came from a large Catholic family, Midwest, saying, whereas my grandmother came from a very respected and upright Lutheran family, Oh, yes. And I guess it was a huge scandal that they got married. And he was 23 and she was 16. That's their wedding vow. Yeah. So they're telling me this all really gleefully, and they're like, your grandfather, he was quite the wheeler and dealer. It was said that he could go out in the day with a goat and come back in the evening with a horse. Because he was quite the wheeler. I'm like, Grandpa? Lawrence Welk grandpa? And this was one of the things I started learning about, how he raised prize-winning dogs. He raised pigs. They tried to do farming, but it actually didn't work out very well because they'd rather make more money doing trapping. So, and they were kind of looked down on by the other farmers, like, all it needs is some hard work. Like, no, we're just going to go do some trapping instead. I know that he was the eldest of like 12 kids. And in the Depression, his parents, Emma and Peter, would go to Florida to get work, and they would leave him to raise some of the older kids at that age, at a really young age, starting it when he was actually 14. I mean, it's kind of amazing what we think about. And I think about, his life. When he ended up, he bought some land in near Seattle for $2,000, and he sold it for $1.5 million. And that was like 25 years ago, so you can imagine what it'd be worth today. It's now all built up. That house is no longer there. And I think about all of his children and how successful they've all became, quite successful in their lives and have led really quite happy lives. And a lot of it had to do with the hard work that he put into this very early on. And I think about, my own life, that I learned some of that hard work and ingenuity ethic from him. You do whatever it takes to feed your family, to be there, and to make it happen. But it just struck me how, we don't really know our history, right? We don't know all of the struggles of those that came before us. And it's also true for this church as well. So I want to tell you some stories about this church and how it came to be. Because it wasn't as simple, because we could just simply tell you some dates. So that in 1953, the church was started by Catherine Hoffman, who was a Universalist minister's daughter. There was a little thing in the newspaper actually about it. But it doesn't tell you everything that, she came here looking for a liberal church and she couldn't find one. So she's like, I'm just going to start one. I'll be darned. Okay, how do you do that? Well, she contacted the Universalist Association and said, give me the list of everybody who's on mailings in the area. And she called every single one of them and invited them to her home. Right? She also reached out to the local Unitarians, which had tried to form a group, but they hadn't quite made it. But they started coming in and helping out, and they started joining. Some of them joined up with the Universalists. And this is in 1953, before the Unitarians and the Universalists merged in 1961. So we were ahead of our time already. In 1953, her living room became too small, even though it was rather large. So they moved to a place called Moose Hall. Okay? Now, there was a reason why it was called Moose Hall, because they actually had a huge moose that looked down on everything. And there's a wonderful article by the starting minister who helped them sort of start up. He was kind of a part-time minister there. And he writes in this newsletter article basically that, oh yes, do you remember the moose that would look down on the parishioners as they entered the hall, their glassy stare, And you remember that there would be a fish fry the night before, since this was a community hall. And the smell would permeate into the sanctuary, and there would be the drums left over from the party the night before, and they'd have to clean up everything. And sort of gives a little bit like, oh wow, so this is where we began, right? Then in 1956 they moved to the Ebel Clubhouse in Balboa. I don't have a picture of that because that no longer exists. So now they're actually moving. At least this place doesn't have fish fries, but. They're starting to move up and get everything, but this is 3 years since when they started. And they start dreaming of their own home. They actually ended up then moving in 1959 to the Friday Afternoon Clubhouse, which is now known as the Costa Mesa Women's Club. So you can see that this is it here, and it still stands today. So they moved there, and at this point they're starting to grow a little bit. They're not huge. I think they're like 50, 60 members, something like that. And they're starting to grow, and they really want to build their own home. So back then they start building. They found a piece of land. I believe it was 30 acres, something like that. I can't remember how much it was. But they started building in 1959. And they did it a little bit like, you couldn't do it this way today, okay? Like Jack Webb, who was a member and an artist, actually drew up the plans for it. Okay, he was the architect. I don't think you could do that today. They built a lot of it themselves, and they started with the exterior, like they were just going to build the exterior to start. And then they needed about $31,000 to build. Can you imagine $31,000 to build? I think it's amazing to me. About $11,000 of that was donations, but they got a loan from the Troop Memorial Church up in Pasadena. Beautiful old church. They gave a $15,000 loan, but they still needed about $5,000 more. And I have no idea how they got it, but they did. I don't know if they went back and they did ask. I don't know if someone gave that money, whatever it is, but they managed to make it happen. Because they had all the exterior, but they didn't have any of the interior done. So then in so they actually built it in 1959, but it took them about 2 years to actually get in the building. And then there were all these expansions that happened afterwards. So in 1963, there was the Tracy Boag building. Tracy Boag had been a wonderful youth. She was 16 years old when she passed away from a long and difficult illness. And her family wanted to honor her, and so donated a large fund. And that helped, for the most part, putting the Tracy Boag building. In 1980s, there was expansion of the sanctuary. They actually ripped out some offices and to try to expand the sanctuary. And then in 1989, Joan Gillen building was built. It was a new religious education building for the children. Joan Gillen had been the religious educator par excellence for years, and her family is still a part of this church. And so we're very grateful. So she was the major donor on that one. But the whole church came together to make it happen. And some of you I know were here. How many of you were here when that was built? Yeah. So you all know. And you all know, I'm willing to bet that as I'm telling this, how far more complicated it was. Am I right? For those of you, yeah, I can see some nods. So there was also expansions, like they did some lovely landscaping. They added in a playground. They added in a beautiful garden, right? They did other things, like here was the beginning chairs that they had in the sanctuary. They renovated the sanctuary a number of times. Their chairs have gotten a bit of an upgrade. I think that's in the 70s or 60s, I'm not entirely sure, but yeah. And then here was, before you moved here, this was the sanctuary. You'll remember those chairs. You can see where we get the idea of these chairs from, right? So there was quite a lot going on throughout all those years. But then, since beginning in 1964, we hear rumblings in the newspaper, the newsletter, the church newsletter, about trouble with parking. A park is built across the way. There's no street parking. They put a 4-lane road in front. There's very difficult parking. They had leased a parking lot next door, but the problem was that a developer came along and it was going to be built into condos. And so this church was facing the fact they were going to have almost no parking. There was like just a little bit in the front of the building. So what do? Right? And it was a big time of anxiety and challenge, and like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? They've been talking for years. They knew they were landlocked, right? So about 6 months before I came, it turns out that the realtor came along and said, so are you all interested in selling? And they're like, well, we don't really have a place to go. And the realtor said, well, actually, we might very well have a place to go. So you all sold your church before you even knew you had a home here. Imagine the anxiety for those of you who weren't here that caused. And yet, it worked out. And 6 months later, I came. So we've been here since I've been here. But I remember also that first year that I came here, because moving to a new place when you've got it fixed up, and this whole room was not like this. A lot of the rooms weren't that way. So much has changed, in fact. So this is what some of the early pictures of it, before there was any landscaping, before there was this beautiful courtyard out here, all of that was here, right? And some of you may not be aware that we faced a $70,000 deficit. I offered to go part-time, because I was like, we got to give this a go. I thought, well, maybe the district can give me some work or something. I didn't know how I was going to make that work. We didn't have to do that. We borrowed from the endowment. We did another ask. People came up with more money for their pledge. People had already given quite a bit for a bridge loan. It was a time, but we made it through. We did it. We had to cut some things that was heartbreaking in some cases, but we did it. We got through it, and we came here. And now we're at this point. We're at a new crossroads, because we're getting to the point where our sanctuary is full on Sunday morning. And you might say, well, I see chairs around here. But here's the thing. The 80% rule. When you get to the point when you're at 80%, that's when it becomes a challenge for growth. Because say you have a family come in, a family of 4, where are they going to sit? There's no place in this thing where they can sit together, right? So the 80% rule is that we need to expand and to grow in this congregation. History is never simple, but we are in the middle of making that history, right? The decisions that we make today are going to help us figure that out. But I'd like to let us think about and honor this ecclesiastical history that we have. There's a song that you all sang when you moved here that you all know very well. Let's sing that song.
We
did. You got here. By hook or by crook, you got here, right? Now, think back to all of those decisions that were made and all those people that had to make all of those decisions that leads up to this point here. I'd like the Board of Trustees to stand for a moment. And I'd like also those who are on the property use group to also stand and join. So these are the people who lie awake at night, who worry, who stress, who are making decisions that are affecting this church, and they need your support. Can we please give them a huge round of applause? And all these wonderful people who are bringing their gifts to this church to make difficult decisions and to wrestle with all of this, decided, boy, you know what, maybe we need to bring in an outside expert to give us some help in this. Because we can't know how they did it in the past. We know that they did it, but we can't know how they did it, right? But we can ask someone to come in here and say, so how do others do it? Help us understand that. And that's why we have Kay Crider here today with us. Kay Crider is a consultant with the Stewardship for Us organization, and she is an expert in stewardship, management, and leadership. She teaches it at University of Oregon, and she is also a Unitarian Universalist out of our Eugene congregation, Eugene, Oregon congregation. So please let us welcome Kay.
Thank you. Reverend Sean put the picture up there, so we'll just go to the next slide right away. All right, so I've been here. It's been great to be with you this weekend, and then I've had some sessions with the board and some of your teams in advance of coming here and reviewed a lot of documents. You sent me a lot of great information, and you have a lot of great things going on here right now at this congregation. So you have a well-loved, settled minister, and there's a lot of churches that don't have that. They have an interim or a consulting or developmental. Not that those are bad ministers, but it's a different relationship when you have a love relationship with your settled minister where you hold each other in a special way. So I heard wonderful compliments about Reverend Sean when I was here from folks, and so it's a gift to have that established relationship. So you have a balanced budget. That's great as well. You've been working hard to get there. As you heard from Reverend Sean, you were in a different financial place when she got here, and she's starting her 7th year now. So you're doing great in that regard. And you have a strong community with low conflict. Everybody was really loving and kind to each other in all the meetings that I had, and that's not always the case. You know, I like to tell the truth. Sometimes I go places and there's things brewing. Not to say we all love every single thing that all the rest of us say in church, but you're doing great in that regard, so I wanted to hold that up for you. You have a beautiful campus here with capacity for growth. If you've been around, you know that this building over, the extension over here is the place where you want to build your new sanctuary and feel like you have a more spiritual space that can accommodate people who are coming. And you have lots of parking and lots of bathrooms. Both those things are common problems at churches that I visit all over the West. So, and then you have a growing RE with experienced leadership. It's a lovely gift that you have Reverend Judy, who's heading that up. And you have growing adult faith formation programs with half of the congregation participating in one form or other in that, which is a really key, thriving thing. Your music ministry, people in every meeting I was at held up Beth as being really someone that they love, and that they were marveling at the choir, marveling at how many people are participating, and how much the music ministry really touches them at this congregation. And then you have impactful social justice work, and I didn't list everything, just a couple of things that people talked about while I was here, the LGBTQA+ and the Environmental Film Festival, and I'm sure there's much more that you're working on, but all those things are fabulous things that you do here together in community, and that you should be proud of. So I had an electronic survey that went out, and if you haven't had a chance to take it yet, no worries. There are links you can still take it through this coming week, and I will redo the stats before I write my written report that you'll get in a couple of weeks. But I asked what are the top 3 strengths. So 66 of the 52 folks who responded to the survey so far said that the minister's staff is top strength. 54% said your Sunday services. 48% said that you're welcoming and inclusive is one of their top 3. Music, 46%, one of the top 3, and 44% said the community and the people are the top 3. So that was one of the questions. Top challenges. So you can see there on the challenges that membership growth and facilities are up there near the top. So those 2 things are related, right? As you heard from Reverend Sean, when you're 80% full, it's hard for folks who are just visiting and coming in to feel like they can wind their way over and find a seat amongst the people. You know, what if they have to get up and leave in the middle, or you know, what if people are drawing them in? This is the top 2 challenges that folks mentioned were the facilities and membership growth. So I asked the question about growth, and I asked, would you prefer no growth? Would you prefer 5% annual growth or 10% annual growth? And 70% of you wanted growth, and here's a chart here that shows that almost half of you, 47% wanted 10% growth, and 47% tied for 5% growth, and then just about 6% said that they did not want any growth. And this is a good-looking pie chart. Sometimes I get that little green section as larger, so 5% is really, because we know people come and go, really the achievable. Sometimes you're able to get to that 10% a year, but I asked that question so we can see how people are feeling about welcoming other folks. So for a capital campaign for your new sanctuary, just to give you an idea, a typical range would be 3 to 5 times your annual giving, which for you is roughly $500,000 to $1 million. I have the calculations are $560 to $950, and so right now you're at 3 times your annual giving, with about half of the congregation who's indicated that they are giving a gift for a new sanctuary. And some congregations that we've worked with in the last few years have raised 6 times, 7 times, even 9.75 times. So 8 times your annual giving gets you to 1.5 million, which is the estimated cost of your sanctuary. And just 5.5 times your annual giving gets you to 1 million. And that means you would add some sort of reasonable loan and a grant. You have a wonderful opportunity here in this geographic area that most congregations across the country don't have, where you can get possibly up to $200,000 towards your new sanctuary. So just to let you know what that means, in terms of a gift chart, in a perfect world, if we all had $10,000 to give, we could all, for your 95 pledging households, you'd get to your $1 million goal and have a grant and a loan, and then you'd be done, and you'd be off, and the hammers would be swinging, right, to build your new sanctuary. But we know that that's not the way life works, right? There's a range. So I just put up there, just as food for thought, what kind of gifts are needed, because for any kind of building, if it's a $50 million building or a $500,000 building, you need your anchor gift of at least 15 to 20%. So right now, your top level of giving is $50,000, but that doesn't mean that you can't get to that $1 million. Here's what a gift chart looks like for a $1 million campaign. And so I have what the gifts needed are and the number of gifts so far. And I don't put this up here as you can't do it. It's just a piece of information. Here's what it looks like for a $1 million goal, and I'll have all these available if you want to look at them more later, if you add a grant and a loan. So again, that's just 5.5 times your annual giving. So you actually can do this if you decide you really want this new sanctuary. So my advice for you moving forward is to be ambitious and stretch and be practical too for this legacy project. You heard from Reverend Sean how your forebears extended and really did what they thought was impossible years ago, and you're benefiting from what they did, and you can benefit, you know, in these next few years and onward from what you do now, and then folks that come after you will benefit from your building of a sanctuary that will give you the space that you would like to, not only on Sundays, but to be used for lots of other things where you can do outreach for the community. So when you're approaching this project, it can seem big and daunting, so I just encourage you to hold each other's hearts in your hands and listen attentively. People will have concerns, they will have dreams, they will have fears, and express appreciation often. You already did that this morning, and I know you've got a capital campaign team that's worked really hard as well on this. So let people know it takes a lot of hearts and hands to make these projects work. So if you have a shared vision and shared values, which I know that you do, and that builds deeper connections. So all of that leads to fulfilling your hopes and dreams for this congregation here. So I invite you now to join us in another singing.
So here we are at a crossroads that our church ancestors had been at many, many times before us. They found a way to move forward. It wasn't everything all the time exactly what they wanted, but it was enough. Now for me, I feel like there's two reasons why we need to build. And one, you know, I told you a little bit about, but the other came to me actually. We were talking Friday night at a board meeting about this, a meeting with Kay, and the board members went around and said why they love this church. And it just hit me. I was like, this is the reason why we need to build something, okay, whatever it ends up being. This room, it just does not reflect the warmth, the community, the sense of compassion that is this congregation. It just doesn't. I mean, you walk in and it looks a little bit like you're entering a conference, right? Or some meeting or some business situation. But I know you all, and I know this depth of your love, the depth of your commitment, the depth of your just compassion for one another. I've seen it in action, and I'm like, when people walk in here, do they see that? Because this just doesn't reflect that, right? And I want people to immediately see it. To not have to take a few months to get to know one another and get to know the things, because that's what happens. People walk in and they, oh, I don't know. And I don't blame. I mean, we all do that. We do a little bit of judgment real quick, right? Because yes, I would love to have a love, shiny new sanctuary for my own ego, right? It would be nice. But I think we all can agree, we all got enough ego that we'd like a nice, shiny sanctuary, okay? But the reality, this room just doesn't reflect that. I mean, I see it in you all. I see it in your eyes. I see it in your body language. I know some of your histories here at the church, and I see it, but they don't. The other reason is that, it gets to this idea of, we're outgrowing this sanctuary. But it's because I think of Unitarian Universalism as a saving message, which is kind of an odd thing to say since we don't believe really in hell for the most part, at least not an afterlife of a hell. But that warmth that we have, this idea that absolutely everyone is welcome here, whoever you are, right? Unitarian Universalism is too big for this room. We need to be a place where everyone can come in and feel welcome and not have to go, oh, where can I sit? I don't know if this is my place, right? We need a place that reflects that value of everyone being welcome all the time. If we are going to be about building beloved community, I think that's what we need to do. So right now we've got about 50% of the congregation who's pledged to the capital campaign so far, and we need actually 80% if we're going to make a go of it. And if there's a major donor out there, awesome. Now, I do know that everyone in here has different giving capacities, right? And Kay spoke to that, right? It's sort of like, I like to think of it as like Porthos, Aramis, and Athos, right? Each of them had their gifts and they gave as they were able in what they had. Some people are going to have more money to give, it's just a reality. But others are going to spend time painting, fixing things up, landscaping, putting out signage, whatever it is. And absolutely everyone here has the capacity to give moral support, right? So for those of you who do have financial capacity, we need you now. For those of you without that financial capacity, we need you now. Your love, your emotional support. Whatever we end up doing, this church is ultimately about the people and not the walls, right? Our choir sang this morning, love can build a house that stands forever, stronger than walls of steel and stone. We will always have one another. Love is what binds this community together. We build love every day when we reach out to one another and help one another with that loving hand. The Three Musketeers are known for that famous saying, right? All for one and one for all. But actually, that's actually the shortened version of it. The full quote is this: it's all for one and one for all, united we stand, divided we fall. Let us today, let us write history. Let us write a bold new future together. Let us sing about love.
Is
one for all.